He stands at the crossroads of music and the mathematics of architecture. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Iannis Xenakis. Though Xenakis was born in Romania in either May or June of 1921 or 1922, both of his parents were of Greek origin, and they served as his first forays into the musical world. His upbringing was musical. His parents were Wagner fans who at one point went to the Bayreuth Festival when Iannis was very young, but mostly he embraced architecture and engineering, which were fields that were more overtly mathematical on their surface level than was music, although music does have mathematical underpinnings, and he liked those where he heard them, specifically in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, which can be highly numerological in nature. He did love music, saying that he was struck apocalyptically the first time he heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but for a long time he was just an avid listener. Xenakis got into the National Technical University of Athens, but World War II was incoming, and on the first day of classes the school was shuttered because the Italians invaded. Xenakis soon became part of the anti-fascist movement in the Greek People's Liberation Army, but let's make one thing clear. These people weren't just anti-fascist, they were very specifically pro-communist, so they were still extreme, but just in a different direction. When Axis forces were forced to retreat from their Hellenic occupation as the war drew toward its conclusion, Greece was plunged into a massive crisis when the British occupying forces attempted to restore the monarchy. The ensuing Greek civil war between the Allied-backed Greek government and the Soviet-backed communist groups saw Xenakis once again fighting for the communist cause, and this very nearly got him killed. Shrapnel shredded one side of his face, and for the rest of his life he only ever had sight in one eye. In fact, when the British shell hit, his two friends who were in the building, or should I say comrades, left him for dead because they saw his mangled face and body and they thought that no one could possibly survive it. But he ended up surviving it. His father found him, and he spent 2 months recuperating in the hospital. Somehow he was still able to earn a degree in civil engineering throughout all of this, but his politics were never far behind. As the Cold War settled in across East and West, the Greek government, which had slipped further and further to the right wing after the communist defeat, began imprisoning people who leaned too far to the left. Xenakis himself had flown under the radar since his close encounter of the British shell kind, but even he was imprisoned on several occasions. And he wasn't nearly as outspoken about his beliefs as were some of his friends. Or, again, comrades. He initially planned on going to the United States with the help of a forged passport that his father helped him get, but he ended up in Paris, France. He snuck in, and he just decided to stay there. Illegally, mind you, but it was a life-saving measure because the Greek government sentenced him to death in his absence, so he couldn't go back to his homeland even if he wanted to. Despite his less-than-legal status, his abilities as an architect led him to employment under a politically expedient architect who went by the name Le Corbusier. At first, he was sort of low on the totem pole. He was given others' designs and basically told to run the numbers to make sure they could stand up straight. But eventually he approached his boss about becoming an architect outright. Le Corbusier and Xenakis agreed on one major principle. Instead of taking the big picture and working progressively inwards from there, one could start with the smallest possible kernel of an idea and then expand that outwards. This was initially just a purely architectural idea, but Xenakis realized that it could also be used in terms of music, which he was writing on the side throughout all of this, sometimes at the expense of his sleep. Xenakis' biggest architectural project was the Philips Pavilion, a beautiful and organic structure built for the World's Fair Expo in Brussels in 1958. This building was specifically designed to house a fully electronic piece of music called Poème électronique, composed by Edgar Varèse, and this also impacted the way Xenakis perceived music. That is, Xenakis began to really think deeply about music as a form of sound architecture. It is at this point that we see architectural concepts begin working their way slowly and surely into his music. Xenakis' problem? Well, he just couldn't seem to get any composer to take his music with any degree of seriousness. He went to see various members of Les Six, the loose collection of composers who banded around Erik Satie, the writer and general artistic polymath Jean Cocteau, and a general anti-impressionistic stance, but none of them really liked what they saw. Arthur Honegger kicked him out of his class for parallel fifths, saying that his work, early as it was, contained no music. No word on what he would have thought of the later stuff. Nadia Boulanger also turned him down, as she already had plenty of great and promising students and didn't seem to want to put up with Xenakis' ideas. To the esteemed Mademoiselle, whatever talent Xenakis had in him was stymied. He was too much of a beginner for her to bother taking on. Finally, at long last, he found a composer who was willing to take him under his wing, Olivier Messiaen. But Messiaen went opposite his usual thinking. Though his music can sound quite unusual, he was of the opinion that study of the fundamentals of Western music was the basis for all composition, no matter the style. With Xenakis, he said to, outright avoid traditional training. That yes, Boulanger was right, it was somewhat late for him to get into the game, but he had things that other composers didn't have. He had all of this high mathematical training. He had this Greek heritage, and Messiaen told him that he should use those in his pieces, that he should embrace what he had that made him so unique and different. Xenakis would, in essence, stick to this for the rest of his career. Rarely did he write a piece that was not mathematically informed, and rarely did he write a piece that did not have a Greek title, even though he was fluent in multiple languages. One of the first big pieces to incorporate this idea was Metastasis, written in the mid-1950s for an orchestra of 61 musicians, none of whom have the same part. This was a groundbreakingly bizarre piece, which used a technique called sound masses, which are essentially orchestrated tone clusters. Xenakis used these to represent views of time and energy that theretofore weren't expressed anywhere in the Western tradition. By putting these architectural concepts into his music, Xenakis effectively created a strikingly avant-garde piece, similar to, but yet still distanced from, the works of his Messiaen studying contemporaries. Space was also a factor, but not physical space. It reached what Xenakis referred to as a third dimension, easily accessible in architecture but not necessarily in music. But it's kind of hard to understand what he means by this because his writings on this can be incredibly dense. Xenakis presented this score to the conductor Hermann Scherchen, who loved it and said that it seemingly came from somewhere outside music. Metastasis is unique in its crafting of a gestalt. No one individual part can be heard, but taken as a whole there is a sound, just as no one gun can be picked out of a mass of gunfire. And he probably was pulling from that source, because he had seen a lot of really nasty and brutal stuff. Though Xenakis would often conceive of his pieces visually and indeed draw graphs to help him, he always wrote his pieces out in their final forms in as traditional a notation as he possibly could, with, lines and stabs and clefs and notes. Where a lot of composers were abandoning these in favor of graphic notation, he always stuck to what people really could read more easily. It's not like his stuff's easy to play. Another of his interests, which was deeply tied into what he tried to do in his more traditionally written music, was Musique Concrete, which is essentially the first truly electronic music genre. Composition was all about the ability to, and thus your fluency in, mixing and splicing and mastering bits of analog tape. It was a slow and painstaking process with crude equipment, but it allowed composers to work directly with recordings and thus work directly with sound sources that went outside traditional instruments. You could record anything, and then you could splice it together and edit it. It was just analog remixing in the earliest and most crude sense of the term. Edgar Varèse was the first composer to really take this seriously, as he believed that any sound could be music so long as the composer chose the right way to use that sound. Xenakis and Karlheinz Stockhausen and even György Ligeti were not far behind, although Ligeti would find the process a little too tedious, and he would abandon it after about 2 pieces. And it was indeed extremely tedious work. One slip-up in one splice or edit could render months of work entirely useless. Xenakis used sounds that were both natural and unnatural. It's not uncommon to hear, say, a jet engine in one of his Musique Concrete pieces. Xenakis is considered the founder of, and really the only composer in the field of, stochastic music, where the word stochastic refers to something that is randomly generated. But unlike, say, the work of John Cage, whose music is merely indeterminate, Xenakis actually put complicated math behind this. Essentially, it's chaos theory in music. One of the unique factors he took into account were the things he called in-time and outside-time structures, which he elaborated upon in many writings. Universal in Xenakis' music is an extreme level of difficulty and an extreme intensity. Hearing any Xenakis piece makes you feel like you're absolutely gripped to your seat, in for an absolutely wild ride of torrents of sounds and manic shrieks. While each of his pieces were derived differently from different mathematical structures, it did not take him very long to compose a piece, despite the complexity of the math that was behind an individual work. He was surprisingly prolific and didn't really seem to ever have writer's block. Ligeti, who shunned both tonality and atonality for a synthesis of styles he called non-atonality, did not think that Xenakis' practices led to a coherent style of music. He believed that simply dressing up a formula in musical terms was not enough to create a true work of art. Xenakis had criticized the serialists back in the 1950s, and even though the serialists came to appreciate and understand Xenakis' works, Ligeti lumped Xenakis in with the rest of the serialists, saying that, in essence, the end result wasn't all that much different. As Xenakis' standing advanced in the post-war serial environment, his music was prized for its mathematical cleanliness and its efficiency in converting these formulas into music. But what he had going for him that the serialists didn't was the ability to turn these into pieces of raw emotional power. There was a sense of viciousness and biting acidity to his works that were missing from the high modernists who dealt entirely in serialism. Everything from game theory to statistics to how gases moved in a sealed state was on the table, and Xenakis found ways of embedding these structures at every single level of a composition. With the dawn of personal computing, he was able to write programs that helped him write these pieces. Amongst these were UPIC, which allowed for real-time waveform digitization. Someone could draw a waveform and then draw how that waveform functioned in time. And you didn't even need to understand music in order to be able to work not just on a synthesis level, but down to the level of the waveform itself, the smallest possible component of a synthesized sound. Another important program was ST, which itself was so important that it made it into the title of various pieces that were composed with its help. The first of these was a large ensemble piece called, and brace yourself, ST/48-1 240162. I'm not kidding, that's the title of the piece. ST stood for stochastic, 48 for the number of performers, 1 for the iteration of the program that he ran it on that day, so this is the first one, followed by the date. Now, us here in America are not used to seeing the day come before the month, but we also use Fahrenheit, so I don't think we can judge. Xenakis had so many stochastically derived functions in the pieces in this ST series that he needed the help of the computer just to keep it all straight. He plugged all this information into the computer, and it spat out the piece, which he then transcribed. Though Xenakis' music is almost completely diametrically opposed to the work of Aaron Copland, it was Copland who invited Xenakis to teach at the Boston Symphony's prestigious Tanglewood Institute in the summer of 1963, recognizing that Xenakis was an important and unique voice in the compositional world. Copland was even known to occasionally conduct Xenakis whenever he went around and guest conducted major American orchestras. Around this time, Xenakis also published a book called Formalized Music, which is so heady and so dense that even today, Xenakis fans or other composers who dabble in algorithmic composition in Xenakis' vein have a hard time getting through it, because there's just so much in there. I mean, we're talking about people who spend a lot of their waking hours wrestling with complicated computer programs, and if they don't really have a solid idea of what Xenakis was talking about, I mean, that's assurance that he was really far down this one particular rabbit hole. Some of his pieces even got performed in Greece, but he couldn't attend for obvious reasons. He did, however, manage to become an official French citizen about 20 years after sneaking in, and this was in part due to the help of Les Six's resident communist, Georges Aurich. Xenakis taught for a time in the late 60s and early 70s at the University of Indiana, but resigned in protests after the university kept delaying construction of a promised music lab. From thence he moved on to a professorship at the University of Paris. It wasn't until 1970 that Xenakis was more frequently performed in his homeland, and it took until 1980 for his works to be first performed in the Soviet Union, when the seeds of its collapse were already brewing. He was exposed to a wide variety of non-Western instruments and musics, but he rarely took inspiration from them like some other composers did. He, for instance, went to both Bali and Java, but never wrote anything that was gamelan-inspired. The only piece of his to use any non-Western instrument was a piece for a few Japanese instruments that he wrote in 1985, and I'm not giving you the title of that because I don't trust myself to pronounce it. Xenakis' health went downhill through the 1990s, and he finished his final work in 1997. He died in February 2001 at the age of 78. Xenakis' politics were not something he discussed past his youth. His disfigured face was an ever-constant reminder of his more vulnerable years. He seemed to have retained a penchant for the radical left wing, writing not just in support of the counterculture movements of the 1960s, but saying that he believed that the youths who led those movements would lead to a worldwide revolution that would upend every established system. Which didn't really happen, but I guess it's the thought that counts. He said that the thought of going to the Soviet Union never even crossed his mind. He was aware of their political repression, and he despised their brand of authoritarianism. Karl Marx, to Xenakis, was the closest modern equivalent of Plato, but even he thought that Marx's views were too simple-minded because he believed in an eventual harmonious existence to humanity, and Xenakis knew that wasn't going to happen. Xenakis believed firmly that music was emerging into a new age, where computers and synthesis would replace all traditional instruments, and where science, not philosophy, would serve as the basis for musical ideas. And while this hasn't entirely happened, the advent of synthesis technology has created a paradigm shift not just in music, but in the culture writ large. And Xenakis, more so than many other great electronic pioneers, can be considered the grandfather of this movement.